Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, mainly in favor of the Russians, with some Ukrainian counterattacks northeast of Pokrovsk. The Russians have managed to advance in the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region as they continue their offensive operations along the border between Belgorod and the Kharkiv regions. The Russians have also managed to advance in several areas north and northwest of Lyman as they continue striking the Ukrainian supply lines and target the supply lines for their own forces to reach the city itself. The Russians are attempting to improve their positions north of Pokrovsk, while the Ukrainians are infiltrating deeper and deeper behind the Russian lines, looking to cut off and encircle the northern grouping of Russian forces. The Russians managed to continue their advances along the western parts of the Donetsk into the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, where there is an interesting update by Deep State Map that I'm a little curious about. Finally, there's been an advance by the Russians within Stepnohirsk in the southwestern outskirts of the front line, along the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia section of the front line. Starting out in the Zaporizhia region, the Russians managed to advance within Stepnohirsk, the western parts of the town. The Russians have managed to secure the intersection here south of the river line, pass through the river line into the northern parts, gaining control over several fortified positions here in the direction of the northern bank of the river line. The Russians are here making use of this intersection to expand in the northeastern direction, pushing into the Dacia area here in the western outskirts of Stepnohirsk, and advancing along the residential area in the southern bank of the river line as well, reaching into the residential area in both the northern and southern banks of the river line. Combined with their assaults in the eastern flank, the Russians are looking to gain full control over the settlement. At the same time, in Deep State Map's map, we can see that the southern road here on the northern bank of the river line is in a gray zone according to them, which indicates that the Russians have a presence in this road to Pokrovsk Street. The Russians may be working on gaining full control over that to connect their forces between the intersection area and the Dacia area in the western parts. The Ukrainians have a significant fortified position here to the north, which blocks the Russian presence on the northern bank of the river line. The Ukrainians can operate from these fortified positions overlooking the settlement from the high ground, both the Dacia area and the residential area. As long as the Ukrainians hold on to these trenches here north of Stepnohirsk, it is difficult for the Russians to solidify their control within the settlement. The Russians are currently making use of the residential buildings to cover for their infantry, but having armored vehicles or a significant presence of forces on the northern bank becomes very difficult. The Russians are currently moving through the river line mostly on foot, where the Russian soldiers are moving from building to building and through the forested areas to reach the northern bank of the river line. However, any large movement of troops or armored vehicles moving through would not be possible before the capture of these fortified positions. Otherwise, it would take a lot of casualties from the Ukrainian firing positions within them, as well as the Ukrainian FPV drone coverage. Stepnohirsk is a very important settlement for the Russian offensive operations here along the first line of defense within the Zaporizhia region, as it covers the western flank of the first defensive line. Gaining control over Stepnohirsk along the apartment complex area in the central parts and the fortified positions on the surroundings will allow the Russians to step up offensive operations on the first line of defense of the Zaporizhia region by also consolidating their positions in the western flank of the defensive line and pushing onwards from the western flank, as they're currently working on the eastern flank of the first and second defensive lines. The Russians continue offensive operations on the eastern flank, where they managed to gain control of additional fortified positions, overlooking the fortified positions further south, as the Russians are approaching in the direction of the Yanchur River. And according to Deep State Map, there is now a massive gray zone here to the west of Novomykolaivka and Novoivanivka. If we take a look at the previous day, we can see that the gray zone is significantly expanding, while settlements such as Ternove and Beresove remain in the gray zone despite geolocated footage confirming the Russian capture of both Ternove, Beresove, and Kalinivske. The interesting part is no Russian sources so far reported on the capture of Novotyorivka, but the entirety of the settlement is now in a gray zone following a September 21st assault by the Russian forces on the town, which the Deep State map reported, and now full control over the town, or a complete gray zone over the town according to Deep State map. When Deep State map changes the gray zone, it is because they have gained a report from Ukrainian soldiers or geolocated footage of Russian soldiers in an area. This means that the Russian forces have appeared deep into the Ukrainian positions here in between Novomykolaiivka and Novoivanivka in the western direction. And this makes a lot of sense, as the Ukrainians do not have any significant fortified positions in between the first and second lines of defense. They have the Yanchur River to the west, and they have the positions along the defensive line to the north. This means these areas are mostly empty of Ukrainian soldiers, especially with the manpower shortage. This means the Russians will likely gain control over these settlements quickly, as well as the fields and forest lines here in between Verbove in the north, Zahoda in the west, and Novovasilivske in the south. This entire area will likely fall under Russian control fairly quickly due to the lack of Ukrainian positions in the area. Instead, the main resistance the Russians are facing is in the vicinity of Stepove and Verbove, where the Ukrainians have their defensive positions, fortifications, and the geographical advantages that they're making use of, alongside the first and second lines of defense, as well as the geographical barrier that is the Yanchur River to the southwest. In the northeastern direction, the Russians continued offensive operations along the northern flank of Pokrovsk, where they managed to advance within Novoshakhove, and to the south of Ivanivka, where the Russians managed to isolate these two settlements by cutting off the southern road connected to Doroshnya. However, there is still the western road which remains under Ukrainian control. Russians are here looking to gain control of both of these settlements to then threaten the supply lines leading into the Ukrainian positions here in the direction of Nikhonorivka, where the Ukrainians have managed to not just gain control over Nikhonorivka, the remaining parts of the settlement, they have also managed to break through the positions of the Russians here in the direction of Boykivka and enter into Novotoretsk. According to a Russian source, the town of Boykivka is entirely in the gray zone, and the Ukrainians, according to the geolocated footage, have even infiltrated deep into Novotoretsk. Whether this infiltration is from the northern or western flank is not clear as of yet. Considering the Russian source claiming Boykivka is in the gray zone, it is likely from that direction. However, it can also be from the northern direction. The geolocated footage reveals a Ukrainian ambush of Russian soldiers patrolling the town of Novotoretsk. Whether they come from the northern or western direction is not obvious, as these are holding an ambush. These are likely special forces of the Ukrainians that are infiltrating deep into Russian lines, ambushing Russian soldiers, and preparing for the main force to push through. Fighting has been taking place in the western flank of Boykivka as well as the northern flank of Novotoretsk over the past couple of days to a week, where the Ukrainians have been trying to gain control of these settlements, which means that this entire area in its entirety from Pankivka to the north, Novotoretsk, and Boykivka to the south are all contested between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians have now gotten a breakthrough in Boykivka and potentially in Novotoretsk as well, which could encircle the entire Russian grouping of forces in the direction of Novoshachove, Kucherev Yar, and Nikhonorivka. And with the push through Nikhonorivka to gain control of that settlement as well, the Russians have a tiny supply line going through a position where the Ukrainians are present on both flanks, which means that the Ukrainians have operationally encircled the Russian forces with direct fire control over their single supply route leading to their forces in the northern direction, which means unless the Russians quickly stabilize the situation, they will likely lose control over the entire area, including Novotoretsk, Punkivka, Mayak, Pankivka, Novoshachove, and Kucherev Yar. The entire grouping of the forces in the northern flank of Toretsk had been lost, with the forces in the direction of Fedorivka, Satishok, Shukhetske, Rudinske, Chervoniye Lyman, and Novoekonomishne would remain under their control for the time being, as the Ukrainians can then move on from Novotoretsk and Boykivka down to Fedorivka and Rasina from the northern and southern flanks to cut off this grouping as well, which would eliminate the Russian positions west of the Kasany-Torets river line. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians are threatening the entire grouping of forces of the Russians here north of Pokrovsk. This would put the Russian siege of Pokrovsk several weeks, if not months, behind, as the Russian forces are currently taking advantage of the Ukrainian redirection of forces on the northern flank rather than the city itself to go deeper and deeper within it. If the Ukrainians free up their supply lines from the northern flank, connecting their forces in Pokrovsk with the Breshkivka road yet again, and fully securing the Kramatorsk-Dobropilya road and then the Dobropilya-Pokrovsk road, the Ukrainians would have full control over the northern and northwestern supply routes into Pokrovsk, significantly strengthening their supply capabilities, and Pokrovsk as a logistical hub in the area, which could allow them to redirect their forces from the river line here in the northern flank and down to the central parts of the city to attempt to kick the Russians back out. The Russians do not control any of the apartment complex buildings such as the Shakhtarsk district or the central apartment complex area or the northeastern or northwestern industrial areas, which means they do not have a solid foothold within the city yet, which means the Ukrainian counterattack could kick the Russian forces out of the city if they do not stabilize and reverse the situation in the northern flank. To the northeast of this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Lyman, advancing in the northern flank of Stavki, gaining control over the forest patch area and the road connecting from Kolodziasy to the forest patch area, securing the southwestern flank of Kolodziasy, activating it as a logistical hub for the forces to push in the direction of Stavki, gaining control over which will significantly bolster the Russian offensive capabilities in the northern flank of Sarishne and northern flank of Lyman, as the only settlement here on the north of Lyman. At the same time, the Russians are storming Derilove and Novoselivka here on the northwestern flank of Lyman. The Russians are here pushing towards Derilove to gain control over the settlement, allowing them to push in the southern direction towards Dobrisheve and gaining control over additional parts of the forest patch areas, further securing additional supply lines to strengthen their forces to the north of Dobrisheve. And at the same time, they crossed over the river into Novoselivka is their goal of cutting off their supply lines of the Ukrainians northwest of Lyman. Cutting off Novoselivka and getting control over the settlement would leave just a singular road going through Dobrisheve and Yarova here along the Donetsk river line remaining under Ukrainian control, as well as the railway area that goes through the same area. Getting control over Novoselivka will allow the Russians to expand their presence into the forest patch area here along the Uska river line and the Donetsk river line and cut off the final road, as well as push in the direction of Dobrisheve through Derilove and Novoselivka from the southern and eastern roads into Dobrisheve, which both will allow the Russian forces to completely cut off the supply lines going into Lyman from the northwestern direction, leaving just the southern and southeastern supply routes remaining under Ukrainian control in the direction of Lyman, where the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Yampil and Sarishne on the eastern flank to cut off the eastern road, which would leave just the southern road, which the Russians can bombard with MLRS strikes or airstrikes to blow up the bridge and any other connections that the Russians would detect along the river line for the siege of Lyman, where the Russians would be looking to cut off the supplies for the Ukrainians, gain control over the settlement, and establish it as their own logistical hub for the northern flank of Slovyansk, a siege in that direction, and offensive operations along the eastern bank of the Uska river line and in the direction of Izium. As for the border area between the Belgorod and Kharkiv regions, the Russians continue offensive operations here northwest of Vodoradnik, gaining control over an additional forest patch area and fighting over the farm area west of the settlement. Russians continue offensive operations along the border area, securing the buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border and developing the offensive operations to connect their forces here along the border section and on the northern flank of Kupiansk, where fighting continues over the city itself, where the Russian Ministry of Defense stated that the capture of Kupiansk would allow the Russians to launch larger offensive operations deep into the Kharkiv region. On the global scene, the United Nations General Assembly is currently taking place, through which Donald Trump and Zelensky met yet again. Through this meeting, Donald Trump completely 180'd his opinion on the war in Ukraine, stating that Russia is a paper tiger and that Ukraine could regain full control over the borders as Ukraine was whole, the 1991 borders, with European help. So everyone took that as a massive surprise. Everyone thought, well, is Trump switching his attitude completely? Is he now going to be supporting Ukraine completely? Is he going to be sending loads and loads of weapons and impose massive sanctions on Russia? As he stated, if Russia did not fulfill the 2-week deadline that he set. Well, it turns out, according to the Telegraph, this may all be a ruse by Donald Trump, where he's looking to wash his hands clean of the conflict. Because what he really stated is that with European help, Ukraine could win. So that he's stating is Europe can help Ukraine win. Russia is a paper tiger. No one should be worried about them. Europe can beat them through Ukraine. And he just doesn't need to do anything, especially since he proposed with regards to the tariffs. Europe needs to put the massive tariffs on China and India. Otherwise, Trump would not put any sanctions on Russia. Therefore, he washed his hands of the sanctions with regards to weapon deliveries. He said that the US stock is not at its necessary level. Therefore, he's also washing his hands from military aid. Therefore, in reality, Trump is more disengaging from the conflict than he is supporting Ukraine through those statements. He did also state that if Russian jets violate NATO airspace, NATO countries should shoot them down. When asked whether the United States would support that NATO country in that scenario, he said it depends on the situation. From here, it is clear he doesn't give a shit. In my opinion, Trump really doesn't care, and what he really thinks is that Ukraine war, he could have ended it, he could have given him a lot of prestige, but it turned out to be much more difficult than he first assumed, so now he just wants to disengage and ignore the situation after trying for half a year, or approximately 8 months, to solve this conflict. But we'll have to see in the future what happens, if his stance changes, or what the scenario is. He might disengage, he might continue, he might impose tariffs, he might not. No one really knows what goes through Donald Trump's mind. In either case, that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.